Do you remember the Bob Marley song? Get up. I won't sing it. Get up, stand up for your rights. Yeah? Some of you will remember that. Some of you are too young. No, some of you are too old. But it was a song apparently that was inspired by a visit to Haiti and seeing the poverty of people. And the response to that was, you need to stand up for your rights. And this is an age in which people stand up for their rights. And perhaps we do it ourselves. And one of the questions that Paul is beginning to raise in this letter is whether that is a good thing and a right thing. When should we? Or more to the point, when shouldn't we stand up for our rights? He began to get us there last week as we looked at the end of chapter 8. And there's more to come next week. So it's not actually the main purpose of our sermon this morning. But that's the fundamental underlying question that Paul is dealing with at this moment. How should we deal with our rights as Christians? But for most of the time, we're going to focus on two principles that come out of the words that are in red on the sheet, in verse 14 and verse 15. Because these principles seem to me to be particularly relevant for our church life at the moment. This teaching might look a bit airy-fairy this morning. What's it got to do with us? Well, I think it's got a lot to do with us, very directly. This is how we know how we should live. So let's start off with verse 14. Those who preach the gospel should receive their living from the gospel. That's a principle that we see not just here in Paul's letter to Corinth, but elsewhere in the scriptures. Preachers of the gospel should be supported financially to live if they are preaching the gospel. Who says? Is that just Paul because he wants to be looked after by the church at Corinth or wherever he is? Well, absolutely not. If you look at verse 15, he says, I'm not writing this in the hope that you will do such things for me. It's not me saying I want your money. But Paul justifies the principle very comprehensively indeed. There can't be any doubt about it, can there? Look at the verses from verse 7. Paul says this principle, preachers of the gospel should be supported as they preach the gospel. The first reason he gives is just a natural human reason, what we might call natural law. Who serves at a soldier at his own expense? You don't fight in the army for nothing, you get paid so that you can do that. Who plants a vineyard and doesn't eat its grapes? It's obvious that you get a reward for what you do. Then in verse 8, he moves on to the Old Testament law. He starts with a spiritual application of a very earthly principle. Verse 9, do not muzzle an ox while it is treading out the grain. If you read through Deuteronomy, that statement stands out a bit because it's in a section where Moses is passing on God's commands for Israel, how they should live, and the commands about treating other people fairly and justly. Then all of a sudden, in the middle of it, if an ox is treading out the grain, don't muzzle it so that it can't eat anything. And Paul says, well, that's a good thing to do. We shouldn't muzzle oxen if they're treading out grain. That's not kind. That's not fair. But he says it means more than that. If it is true for an oxen, then isn't it true for a person? A spiritual application of an earthly principle. Whoever ploughs and threshes should be able to do so in the hope of sharing in the harvest. Well, if preachers of the gospel are spiritually ploughing and threshing and scattering seed, then they should receive a material harvest from that. And then Paul moves on in verse 13 to the specific example of those who served God in the worship of the temple, or the tabernacle to begin with. The Levites who carried out all the practical duties around the worship of God, and then the priests who were responsible for the sacrifices. How did they live? They weren't allotted land in Israel. How could they make a living? How could they support themselves? Where could they get food from? Well, The answer, God's answer, was that they should share in the tithe that was given in thanksgiving to God for his provision. So those who served in the temple were supported in their work by the rest of the people. And then the clincher is in verse 14. The Lord has commanded that those who preach the gospel should receive their living from the gospel. When Jesus sent out disciples ahead of him, he sent out 72 disciples in pairs, and he said, go to the places which I am going to come to and prepare the way, if you like. And as he sent them out, he gave them different instructions, and among them was the saying, the worker is worth his keep. In Matthew chapter 10, if you go to a place, find someone who is worthy, who will put you up on your missionary journey, your gospel journey. And in a similar passage in Luke's Gospel, chapter 10, he says the worker deserves his wages. So when you go, those you go to should give you somewhere to live, so provide your food and your drink so that you have a living from what you are doing. So that principle is pretty clear. The question is, how do we apply it? What is the point? And particularly, what is the point for us today? And the application is simple, that churches should support preachers. I would say that, wouldn't I? We'll come back to that a little bit later on. But churches have a responsibility, if we are to be worthy, to take on board Paul's teaching here. How do we do that? Well, in the Old Testament, I've already mentioned the tithes that God commanded the people to give. They were to recognise his goodness to them in providing for their everyday living by bringing tithes to the temple and offering sacrifices in different ways. And they could go beyond that. They could give more than that if they wanted in different ways. But at least that tithe of the harvest that they had. And that was to support those who served in the worship of God, the service of God. Now, today, we recognise God's provision as believers, both materially and spiritually. We've majored on the spiritual blessings in our worship so far, but we've mentioned the fact that God is good in practical, earthly ways. One of the things we've shared recently is how grateful we are for the fact we live in a place where so many of us have had different reasons to get care from the health service. There are loads of people in the world who don't have anything like that. God has blessed us and we should be thankful. But we need to recognise God's material provision for us. We don't take up an offering in our service here on a Sunday, partly to avoid the idea that if you come in, we're after your money. We don't believe in that, for sure. Partly because in the old days, when you passed the bag, the collection bag, or a plate along the pew, people did have cash. That was the only way to give. Now it's done by, many of us, by standing order in the bank account to bank account, no real money involved. I wonder if we miss something by not having an offering. We don't recognise as often as we should that we respond to God, not just with our thanks, but with our gifts. So in a church which does take up an offering, usually there'll be an opportunity for somebody, the minister or whoever, to give thanks to God for his goodness and to ask the Lord to bless those gifts in his service. But our members of the church, those who belong to the church, give as we are prompted. We're not policed. No one goes checking up on how much you give, but each one of us is responsible and accountable to God. And if a church takes on a preacher, well, there's a responsibility there. So every so often, as we come through the Bible, we're reminded to ask ourselves, how much has the Lord provided for me? Not in crops. I'm not sure anyone here keeps a little window box which they grow something in and then eat it occasionally. It's just about possible in the West End, but not many people do it. But it's not what God has given us in our crops. These days it is money. It's cash. It's a salary if we're working. It's a benefit if we're not working and we're receiving from the state. It's a pension. Maybe there are other things that we receive, but wherever we get the income that enables us to live, to pay our rent, to buy our food, to buy clothes and so on, all that comes ultimately not from our own hard work, not from the giving of taxpayers, not from our investment, it comes from God. Because God could easily take it away, couldn't he? And he's given us all that we have. So am I fulfilling my responsibility? This is the question. Am I fulfilling my responsibility? If I'm a believer and I belong to God's church, am I fulfilling my responsibility as God by giving to support the preaching of the gospel, as I should, in response to his goodness to me? That's a significant question. How much am I giving in response to God's goodness? How do we at Hope support preachers of the gospel? Well, we don't look for help from outsiders. We've had, when I say outsiders, I mean those who don't share our faith. We could apply for grants from the government, this, that, and the other, I expect, for different things, but we don't do that. We've been very generously supported by Christians in other places who have agreed with the importance of gospel preaching, a gospel church, to be here in the centre of London, in the communities in Covent Garden and in Soho. But we can't expect that to continue for what is really, let's be honest, a small local church. There are plenty of churches our size, and they haven't all had the benefits that we have received over the years. So, first of all, the responsibility for a preacher, for supporting a preacher, is ours, the church's. And as we look into the future, that's something we need to take seriously. It's a big challenge. We thank God for what he's provided in the past, not just the money to pay for Michael Toogood, Mike Maller, Derek Still and so on to serve, but the gifts that enable us to buy a flat in Soho, a house in Covent Garden, God has provided. And how else could preachers come in to live in the West End? There's a real practical problem there, isn't there? How much would it cost to rent a flat locally? Go to the estate agent, have a look. You would be, well, you're probably not astonished. You've probably got some idea that it's beyond the means of most people to choose to live in the West End. So these properties allow us to invite someone to come. Properties cost money to maintain, and I get paid by the church. I get supported from the church. The church is fulfilling its responsibility at the moment, but not from its own giving. This is the problem. Our costs, our expenses are much greater than our income from ourselves. So we are still depending on outside and the past. And that's a serious long-term issue if the church is to be sustainable. So we're going to need to think about it. We're going to need to address our resources and our priorities. We're going to have to think about this. What do we need in order for the gospel to continue to be preached here? How can we provide for this? And this passage challenges us to think about our responsibility. But it will never depend entirely on us, will it? Ultimately, we will depend on the Lord. And so we need his wisdom and his guidance as we think through these things. But we do have to take our responsibility seriously. We can't just say, oh, God will sort it out. Those who preach the gospel should receive their living from the gospel. That's an important principle. But it's not Paul's main point in the passage. The main point, and it doesn't complete it here, there's more to be said later on, is in verse 15. Because of that principle, I have the right to be supported by people like you in Corinth, whom I serve. But, he says, I've not used any of these rights. He could have done. He could have said, look, you've got to support me. How do we know that? Well, go back to the beginning of the passage. He says, look, apostles have the right to a living. Not just to be housed and fed, it seems. Verse 4 and 5. Yes, we need to eat and drink to live. Somebody needs to provide that for us if we're to serve in this way. But actually, verse 5, we can bring our wives along as well, and they'll need to be fed as well. They'll need somewhere to stay. So It seems that apostles had the right to do that. The other apostles were taking advantage of that right. Paul's an apostle. The Corinthians know that. They've heard his story, how he was called by Jesus, especially individually, to serve with the gospel. The Corinthians know it because, at the end of verse 2, they are the seal of his apostleship. The fact that the Corinthians have come to faith in Jesus through Paul's preaching, the fact there is a church in Corinth, shows that he is an apostle. They're the proof, if you like. So Paul has the right to ask the Corinthians to support him. But he doesn't do it. Verse 15. I have not used any of these rights. Why not? Well, that's a little bit more tricky to answer, in my opinion, at least, having struggled with this passage, thinking about it this week. But I think there are two reasons that Paul gives why he doesn't claim his rights. The first is in verse 12. Nothing should hinder the gospel of Christ. How would Paul, claiming support from the Christians, hinder the gospel of Christ? Well, it doesn't really seem that it will be a big burden to them. They couldn't afford it. There would be a mixture of people in the church in Corinth, but there were quite a lot. They should have been able to contribute to supporting Paul if that was required. So maybe that's not exactly the reason. Maybe it's to avoid any accusation that, Paul, you're only in it for the money. Now, it doesn't seem that Paul is asking for loss. He just wants a roof for his head and food and drink and so on to be able to live. He's not asking for luxury, it seems. But maybe he is concerned to avoid any sense that it's just another job. Maybe that's it. We know that in our society today, it would be quite a common complaint of people outside the church that there are those who serve as preachers of the gospel who do very well out of it. Now, I think in this country there aren't that many, but we see in the United States lots of examples, it seems, of preachers who seem to flaunt their wealth. They seem to be saying, because we are so blessed by God, that's why we've got these luxury cars and luxury homes. That doesn't fit with the New Testament at all. And Paul perhaps wants to avoid any accusations like that. As he says at the end of the passage in verse 18, he wants to be able to offer the gospel free of charge. You can forget any financial involvement. You're not going to have to pay for this message. I want to be able to preach the gospel so that you can respond to it freely. Now that seems to clash a little bit with what I've just said, the principle that Christians need to give to God. But the giving is to the Lord, not to Paul, that's for sure. So that's his first reason for not using his right, because he doesn't want to hinder the gospel. But the second reason seems to be that Paul gets what we might call satisfaction. Paul gets a reward. Paul can boast, in a good way, from not using his rights. What do I mean by that? Well, it's quite difficult to get to the bottom of it, in my view. Reading what different writers have said about this, I can't say I'm absolutely clear about how what Paul says in verses 16 and 17 fit with that. But I think this is true, that Paul is making a personal expression of his commitment to the Lord who has called him, the Lord he serves. Everything Paul does is done in the Lord. He does nothing for his own sake. We see that clearly if we read through, the account of his life or his ministry in Acts of the Apostles. And if we read his letters, we see that he has a heart for the people he writes to. He's not all about himself. So I think, amongst other things, he wants to show that what he's doing is more than a duty. Paul says he has to preach. Verse 16, I'm compelled to preach. There's an inner compulsion, but there's an external compulsion. Jesus told him to. Jesus commanded him to. He has to. That's his duty. But I think maybe in not using his rights, Paul is showing his willingness to serve beyond that his heart is in it. Because he wants the Lord's commendation. He wants the Lord to say to him, well done, good and faithful servant. You didn't just do the job, your heart was in it. And I value that. That seems to me to be part of Paul's reason for not claiming his rights. But why is he talking about rights? Why is he saying, I've not used them? He's not showing off. And he's certainly not urging the Corinthians to stand up for their rights. There are times when we should stand up for rights, our rights, but the rights of others more likely. Do you remember in Philippi when Paul was falsely imprisoned? No reason to imprison him. When the earthquake took place, remember? The jailer was converted. The magistrates were really worried about what might have happened, and they realised they'd done something wrong. Oh, please just leave our city. Paul makes sure there is a public acknowledgement that he has done no wrong. He's not so worried about him, he's worried about the gospel. It's important that messengers of Jesus are seen to be, if you like, squeaky clean. So there are times when we might stand up for rights, and certainly we stand up for rights in order to serve the gospel's reputation, but also to defend others. The Bible's very strong, isn't it? The Old Testament on standing up for justice for the poor and the weak. And maybe that's the inspiration behind Bob Marley's song. Well, the Christians have an inspiration from God in their service of the poor and the weak. Maybe we will stand up for the rights of others. But when it comes to my rights, my personal rights, then Paul is telling us that there can be much more important considerations than me. We should be much more interested in the needs of the gospel and in the Lord's approval of our lives than we are in standing up for our rights. Now, there are two ways to apply that. One is an application to preachers, because is Paul saying that you've got the right to do this, preachers, to claim support so that you can live, but you shouldn't use it. You should be like me. No, Paul isn't saying that. How do we know? Well, he's not criticising the other apostles. He says they're well within their rights. This is a proper thing to do. It is a responsibility. It's a principle that believers should support those who preach the gospel. And why doesn't Paul keep the command of the Lord, if you like? The Lord has commanded that this should happen. Well, because it's a command for hearers of the gospel, not for preachers of the gospel. The command is not saying to preachers, you must go and make sure you get your money's worth from the people you serve. The command is to the people they serve and say, you've got the responsibility, as we've talked about already, to support those who preach the gospel for you. Preachers don't have to demand their rights. There's a book written by a famous American preacher, and it's titled Brothers, We Are Not Professionals. And it's a series of messages encouraging Christian ministers to realise that they're not following a career. They're not doing a job like anybody else. You know, you go to college, you get your degree, you go off and you search for a job and you get a well-paid job and you go up the ladder. That's not what Christian ministry is about. Christian ministers are servants. And so what matters to them should be the needs of the gospel, the needs of communities which need to hear the gospel, the needs of the church, the needs of the priorities of the church that they serve. That's a different way of thinking from the way of the world. In practice, what gospel preachers receive will depend on circumstances. So I've said before, how could we ask somebody to come into the West End and not provide them somewhere to live? You've got to pay £2,500 a month, well, probably much more than that, to get a flat that's suitable for you and your family. Yeah, you do that. We're not having anything to do with it. And the fact that we've got the properties we have meant that we could invite Keith to come and live in that property with Ruth in Covent Garden. But Keith was only able to join us because his circumstances, and in particular Ruth's support, enabled him to do that. We couldn't demand he did it because we couldn't afford to support him in that way. But the circumstances enabled that to happen. We're looking for somebody to come and take on my role. We should be very careful not to take on someone whose first interest is how much will I earn. Oh, there's a practical side to that. If we're thinking about someone with a family, then they've got a responsibility to consider how will they care for their family. And we need to take that into account. But if they're interested in more than that, if they're interested in money in an improper way, then that's a warning sign. Don't go anywhere near somebody like that. It's a tricky subject to talk about. Members of Parliament and local councillors, they have to give details to the authorities about their register of interests. What things are they connected to that might have a bearing on how they make decisions? Do they have investments in a particular company? Do they have links with people who might benefit from their decisions? Well, if you're a preacher and you're being supported by a church, you've got an interest in this subject. But I hope that I've shown by my attitude over the years that the money thing is not of any significance to me at all in the sort of way that Paul might be referring to. Some of you will remember that before I was called as pastor of the church in Soho, I led the church for 18 months while I was working as a school administrator. So doing that in my spare time, there's no pay, no salary involved. When I was called to serve the church as a pastor, what I'm paid wasn't anything to do with me. The church said, this is what we'll give you, and I just accepted it. Didn't argue for more, didn't argue for less, just took what was offered. When I thought the church perhaps needed to consider its situation financially for the long term, can the church afford a pastor? I said to the church, well, maybe I should go part-time to reduce the burden on the church. And the church said, no, you shouldn't. So I hope you can see that my attitude towards money is in line with what Paul is saying. Yes, I'm paid. Yes, I'm supported. Yes, I have somewhere to live with my family. But that's not because I'm grabbing hold of it. It's not because I'm demanding it. It's because the church has offered it and been able to provide it. But that isn't necessarily the way for every church, and that's not the way in every situation. Circumstances will vary. But let's step away from the church and its responsibilities for preachers. Let's pick up the point that we'll speak more about next week. What's the application for everyone from this? I have not used any of these rights. See, this is Paul's main point. This is what he's going to develop in his letter. If you remember, he's addressing Corinthian Christians, particularly those who have the wrong attitude. He's addressing those superior Christians in Corinth who know they're superior because they follow the right leader. And they very strongly give the impression that if you follow another leader, you are a lesser Christian. He's addressing Christians who think they've got the best gifts and that makes them better Christians. They've got more knowledge than other Christians. And Paul is telling them, you're wrong. That's not knowledge. Last week we read about how some Christians were quite willing, quite happy to eat meat that had been sacrificed to idols. Whether it was in an idol temple or whether it was just meat bought in the market, they said, we are free. Jesus has died to get rid of the old law. We don't need to worry. Idols are nothing. We can eat. And they were right about some of that. But Paul says their attitude was wrong. Because there were other Christians in the church who would follow their example, even though their conscience said, we think this is wrong. People who had worshipped idols, who still hadn't grasped the reality that God is the only God, that idols are nothing, although there are spiritual forces behind them. But they were still thinking it would be wrong to eat, and yet these Christians go and eat, so we better have. They were compromising their conscience. And Paul says that was dangerous for them. That could destroy them. And the superior Christians needed to think about their freedom differently. They needed not to exercise their freedom, not to exercise their rights for the sake of their brothers and sisters. Paul is saying, you need to follow my example. The gospel, the needs of others, needs to come first before your rights. So let me leave you with this, and we'll come back to it next Sunday. How should you think about your rights? What rights do you think you have? Within the church, maybe, but also within the wider world. Do you insist on your rights in your workplace, with your housing association or the council? Do you insist on your rights in a way that actually could be at the expense of the gospel, bringing the gospel into disrepute? If you get angry about something, is it because of me? I'm angry because I have not got what I should have. Does that fit with the spirit of the gospel? Do you get fired up because you get drawn into an argument and it's me against whoever? Or are you genuinely concerned when you stand up for rights? Are you genuinely concerned for the gospel, or perhaps for other people? Are you concerned for fairness and justice and so on? Something to think about, isn't it? Something that has challenged me over the years when I've been involved with the council, perhaps over a housing issue. I've thought that injustice has been done, and sometimes I've been right. But has that been deep down why I've been arguing the toss with whoever it is? Or is it me doing it rather than me doing it for the Lord or for others? That's a good question, isn't it? And what Paul is telling us, and we'll see more next week, that our rights are well worth sacrificing for the sake of the Lord Jesus. And the reason is that he has sacrificed his rights for us.